This is House Planning Help episode 163. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is basement specialist Andrew McInulty. We're going to get an overview of what's important as we create habitable space below ground. First though, as you've come to expect, I will be giving you project updates, and this is actually about trying to release equity. We're moving, or attempting to move, from our current house into rented accommodation, and therefore we'll have the money to progress the project. For some reason, I thought this part of the process wouldn't be too tricky. Perhaps the one thing that's been at the back of my mind is the Brexit triggering of this Article 50 and what that might mean, whether there's a knock-on effect on the market. And I think I've noticed this, even when we bought our land, I'm sure the market was going down because every piece of land that we looked at, it had reached the guide price and then some. But for this one, no, it didn't do that. And that was good for us buying it, but now we're coming to sell something. And whereas I'm sure open days in the past, you'd have an open day in our area and there would just be loads of people. Then on Monday it would go to sealed bids. Then that's it. Job done. You have sold your property. Now we tried the same tactic, creating that open day. Only 6 people signed up. So they had a month to do this. We're in a very central location, so this is desirable. 2 people turned up. So of those 6 people who'd said they were going to turn up, only 2 turned up, which is not good. We did get an offer though, but it was below the guide price, and our cunning ploy here was actually to make our guide price low to entice lots of people in, and then hopefully we would get one that would take us up to the point that we're looking at. So we're at this stage now of thinking, well, what do we do here? This is difficult. We've got a bid below the guide price. Do you take that? Because we don't know what's going to happen to the market in the future. At least then we'll have our equity. Or do we sit around for a while and just hope that there will be more interest? The other thing is that we're coming closer to the spring, and that is naturally the time when a lot of people think about moving. Whether they will this year with Brexit, just not sure how the dust is going to settle just yet. We'll have to wait and see. So there we go. Let's get to our featured interview with Andrew McInulty. Today we're discussing basements, why go down this route, what makes a good basement, what challenges might we face along the way. So we'll find out. First though, I asked Andrew to tell me a little bit about his background.
Well, I've spent an entire working life in the construction industry, from literally as a tradesman working up through the trades, up to contracts management, and from up to multi-million pound projects. I got involved in basements originally, my first one in 1975 in Chelsea Barracks, which is a long time ago. And with this modern method of construction, which you are probably seeing here, when something like 11 years ago, once I come across it, having done many, many basements, understanding the problems connected with it, I thought this reduced a lot of the problems that are associated with basement construction.
When we talk about basements, are we just saying anything underground?
And basically anything that's a single story or more underground, yeah. Whether used for storage, habitable space or whatever, but basically a single story underground and be more, yeah.
Can we have a basement anywhere we can dig down to?
Absolutely. It would be the method of construction of the basement, depending on surrounding structures, boundaries. If you're in an open field or you've got plenty of space around it, it's much more economic. But basically, you can have a basement anywhere, yeah.
If we think historically, when did someone come up with the idea of this? How far back are we going?
Back to caveman, really, because I guess we started off there, but sensibly in recent times in the UK, it's best probably to think back to Georgian times, Victorian times, when basements were quite common. Trade was cheap to build them. They weren't built for the same purposes we now, not generally speaking for habitable space, but generally for storage or somewhere to lock up the mad auntie, that kind of thing, or to store coal, which is delivered on the streets. But basically, you think of it, if one thinks of Georgian, Victorian times, up until the First World War, and then after the First World War, or coming of the railways really in the 1860s, 70s to many outlying towns, There was massive population increase. Land was plentiful. Market gardens in these kind of places around cities were shutting down. Land became plentiful. The space wasn't needed. You had enough above ground space for above ground development.
If we look at basements, we know there are going to be issues with moisture. So can we dig into that and anything else that challenges? You talked about that career starting a few decades ago and then you got to a turning point. So maybe you could just run through some of the things that you've seen in your time.
Slightly before my time, but basically when we come up to the First World War, this development, the explosion in transportation and population, houses needed to be built quickly, particularly between the wars. There wasn't time. There were the costs involved with basements. So basically basements become very uncommon. They weren't necessary, which leads us to actually quite a modern day problem, is that many of our designers today, many of our architects who've done their training and are brilliant architects and technicians, they haven't very little experience of basements generally, and as did their teachers, because of the period since basements haven't been common. And that's what I like to do, is to help architects, structural engineers with the proper detailing and the proper waterproofing methods. That's what we do. That's what I do, yeah.
If they're not done properly, what can happen to basements?
Well, the first and obvious one is, if it's to be used, of course, for habitable space, the commonest thing is the ingress of water. There are, of course, methods of overcoming this, but from the producing a quality basement is initially, in the first instance, it must be detailed properly. The detailing, by that I mean the design, the detailing of it, the junctions, the joints, where the house sits on it or the structure on top sits. That's the structure itself. But before we get there, an essential we need to know is what the soil is like. So the crucial first step is actually to have a proper interpretive ground investigation report. This will tell us about things like the characteristics of soil, the soil type, the characteristics. It will tell us about plasticity levels. It will give us ground bearing pressures, in other words, how much the ground per square metre will carry. It will tell us, very importantly, what level the groundwater's at. This kind of detailed information, and this is the most valuable piece of information and the best value for money one can actually obtain on the whole project. It's absolutely invaluable. Based on that, the engineer, because the structural engineer designing it, can then design the most economic structure to suit those conditions. So it's an absolute vital. No structural engineer will design a basement without a full, proper interpretive ground report. Very, very a crucial element of it.
Are we talking about a very limited palette of materials to construct basements? Because you're not going to have a timber frame basement.
Yeah, properly, in my experience, which is, as I said earlier, 40 plus years now, I see all forms of construction underground, from insulated concrete formwork to brickwork to blockwork with membranes in cavities and internally. And at the end of the day, the most robust, the most reliable, consistent product has to be concrete. There is no question of that whatsoever. Apart from anything else, should it fail, it is totally repairable and permanently repairable, because the injection systems used to carry out any repairs, for instance, if we have the ingress of water, is by an injection system, by injecting particular chemicals into the concrete wall. And the concrete has a density which is great enough to resist the pressure of the injection system you're using. But essentially, it is a repairable thing. With brickwork, blockwork, and other kinds of things, you do not have this density. But there are many, many other reasons for only choosing concrete. You want the minimum number of joints in any material you use underground. That is, for instance, joints between blockwork. You're going to get movement. You'll get any number of problems. So at the end of the day, concrete absolutely is the most robust, it's the most enduring, and it is a material of itself which you can make watertight.
Currently in the Hub, we're looking at a case study where I've seen this basement that you're involved with, and it's not just concrete though, is it? It seems that there are so many different levels to it. So I imagine this is a hugely complicated question, but what else is happening in this type of basement?
As I mentioned earlier, it's about detailing the design and getting the detailing right. But the greatest thing of all, the most consistent thing in my experience in construction, is quality control, is workmanship on site. It doesn't matter how good the material is you're using. It doesn't matter how well designed it is. In basement construction, it's all about detail. It's all about supervision. It's all about the quality of workmanship. With regards to other aspects of basement construction, a crucial element is, apart from the detailing, etc., is the design of the concrete. The concrete mix is crucial. The reinforcement, the spacing of the reinforcement, which prevents concrete cracking, even minor cracking. But the concrete mix design, the reinforcement, the spacing, the type, and any number of other technical things, possibly too technical to go into it, but they're absolutely crucial. It is a holistic thing. It's a total thing. It's the design of it. It's the materials that are involved. It's the workmanship above all. The greatest defect problem, that most defects are caused, most are in workmanship. But regularly I have to say that I receive drawings for schemes where the detailing will inevitably lead to problems with the ingress of water. So that's the major defect. One's got to stop water coming in. The next issue is things like vapour, because of course you can have waterproof concrete, you can still have vapour transmitted across the wall. There are these kind of issues. There are ventilation, which you always need ventilation, whether it's natural or mechanical ventilation, in order to prevent any build-up of moistures internally. So there are many, many things that can go wrong. So it's just careful detailing, good workmanship, good materials, properly designed materials, and excellent workmanship. That's it.
What other things might we come across that this concrete we've talked about is really handy for? So say, for example, heave and things like this. This is another reason that we're going down the concrete route.
The soil report, or the ground investigation report, provides us with the information about for instance, the anticipated movement of soils. Once you remove the overburden, i.e. you dig the hole, clearly this soil at 3 metres or so depth will have been loaded for eons since the world began or whatever, and therefore its removal of this overburden, actually then the soil that's left will, if you like, spring up, will rise. It has a reaction, and that reaction is always upwards. So the amount of that soils, if you will, this reaction from taking the load off, will depend on the type of soil you have. If you're in clay, depending on its plasticity, but generally speaking with clay, you will have a greater grade reaction, i.e. that soil will rise higher than it will if you're in a non-cohesive soil like sands or similar types of material. So that's the thing an engineer has to consider within the design of the structure.
Anything else ground-wise before I move on to planning?
Well, water, of course, is the big thing. Groundwater is a big thing, particularly in many parts of England, and particularly in the southeast. I guess many others. Yeah, this is the art here. Some of the associated costs, depending on the severity of the groundwater, but it is not unusual at all for us to be putting basements in ground where the natural groundwater level is only between 1 metre and 2 metres below the ground, which of course groundwater varies in any event through the seasons, but it's not uncommon at all for walking around our basements after they're completed, and you know that externally the water is above your head height. That's the art of basement construction. So the art there is, of course, is where the skill of the ground worker comes in, who's preparing the ground for you to put your basement in, is to keep that water at bay while you're constructing it. Once it's constructed, once you've finished, once you've backfilled, once you've met certain requirements, then there's no problem at all with the water.
When we think on a large scale of basement construction, how many companies guarantee their basements against water? I can see you shaking your head.
This is a very complex area. Basically, it's something clients are strongly advised to either, if they're not themselves au fait with the small print, the ramifications of warranties, guarantees and contractual arrangements, really should take advice. It's a fact that many of the guarantees have a limited value. For instance, most concrete's used in basement construction, the in situ concrete element will have an additive to it, additive or additives to that concrete to achieve certain objectives. One of the principal ones is to make the concrete, as it were, flow better. You can reduce the water-cement ratio, which is a crucial factor in concrete and especially in waterproof concrete. And this concrete will be guaranteed by the company who supply the additive to the ready-mix concrete supplier. However, that guarantee, and this is across the board, that guarantee is only a product guarantee, and the maximum liability of the company supplying the additives is the cost of the material they supply. That, in my view, is no good to the end user, because there can be any number of contractors involved. There can be a long line of people who won't accept responsibility for it, but above all for the client's not interested in that. They want a watertight basement. Now, that's one issue with guarantees or warranties. The other one is that due to the very recent surge, I say recent, the last decade or so, in the number of basements now being constructed in the UK, it's brought a lot of people into the industry who perhaps don't have the background. And as a result of that, bodies like, or in particular, the NHBC, carried out a survey themselves of their claims against themselves, which were confined to the problem with basements. And in a 5-year period between 2008 and 2013, they had 890 affected properties with claims valued at 21 million, which is fact. I strongly suspect as a result of that, but certainly they rewrote their own technical standards covering protection of buildings underground, and several other third-party insurers. This includes LABC, it includes Self-Build Zone and Premier, all have now withdrawn their warranties, their 10-year warranty they used to grant to clients against the water ingress. So they will no longer insure against water ingress. That cover, in any event, only came into force if the company carrying out the basement works had become insolvent and could no longer do the work themselves. But essentially, it's an area fraught with danger, or a thing for clients to be aware of is the issue of warranties, the extent of those warranties, how good they are. And to the best of my knowledge, and having looked at the paperwork, certainly within the last few months, there is only one third-party warranty provider who will actually insure against the ingress of water, and that's BLP. I'll put that in. I'm not advertising for them, but it is an area genuinely fraught with problems. So in any event, basements now, there is a very, very strict control. The legislation is now very strict.
There's no such thing as an ecological basement from what I can work out. I don't know whether you have any comments on that statement, but this sort of brings us into planning, because basements they're more of a necessity, aren't they, through what planning inflicts on us?
Well, in planning terms, there are actually many advantages, and yes, it's fair to say that planning restrictions play a part in the development of basements, but what they do overcome is, strictly in planning terms, having a basement obviously can provide more habitable space. For instance, it will, on a single-storey dwelling, a bungalow for instance, it will double the size of the habitable space that's available, and that saves the pressure of the planning involvement. Things like ridge heights the problem of overlooking neighbours, the privacy issues in the greenbelt, in areas of outstanding natural beauty, these single-storey dwellings with a basement added, we often provide for in the rear garden of properties because the ridge height can stay within permitted development rules. In other words, it doesn't need planning. So there are any number of planning issues. Another is, of course, and particularly in things like Greenbelt and other sensitive planning areas. In fact, we built in national parks, basements in national parks. It reduces the pressure on local planners for above ground development. If a client, an owner, a property owner has sufficient habitable space with his basement, which has got adequate lighting to it, access to it, ventilation, and it's perfectly habitable from anything from storing cars to swimming pools to showers to bedrooms, which is very common these days, and has all these other adequate facilities that you associate with normal, shall we say, above ground living, then it relieves this pressure on the planners. And it's one of the, if you like, one of the issues we put forward on behalf of clients. It helps them resist, and more easy to resist, and be able to argue the planners, well, look, you've got X amount underground, habitable space. No, it is Greenbelt. One of the principal aims of the Greenbelt, of course, is to prevent interfering with the openness of the Greenbelt, i.e. that means more building work, more housing, more extensions. So it improves it in that way.
Are they looking on it more favourably in that sense that it's underground, nobody's going to see it?
Absolutely. Certainly there are still some local authorities that really are sticking the mud about this, but the general common sense approach from many local authorities, and increasingly so, is that mindful that planning, amongst other things, is about the impact of a structure above ground on its surroundings, on the neighbours, whatever. Most now, many I should say, do take a much more liberal view of basements insofar as that they change nothing. The visual appearance of them has no impact on its surroundings. It doesn't increase the height of the building. It allows a property owner to maximise the use of their plot. And we often build very commonly in the most sensitive areas. We have put basements in Greenbelt, areas of outstanding natural beauty, in the national parks. They're not a problem. And this reason being, they do not impact, there's no visual impact on its surroundings.
Do they ever have the reverse argument that when there is a lot of space and no overlooking or anything like that, they say, well, why don't you just build it above ground?
It's an uncommon reaction, but it gives me the opportunity to suggest to, as I always do, to prospective clients or those thinking of adding a basement, and if they suspect for 1 minute their local authority, who they don't want to broach, by the way, on the subject, but do their own research, but if they think there's resistance to a basement, then you follow the classic planning application route. You put in your application for the dwelling as you want it, to get the maximum footprint you want or you can obtain above ground. You make no mention of a basement. You establish the principle of the new house or the rebuild or whatever. You then go back in for the basement. You then make a subsequent application for the basement. And it makes it very, very difficult for a local authority to resist the basement, but establish the principle of the above ground development first, then go for your basement where you believe your local authority may present you with problems. It is the way to go, because it's the reverse argument. They're more likely, if you go in for a basement, and this is an argument I've heard on many occasions from various planners, but you have all that space underground, here's your volume, why do you need such a big footprint above ground? So the common sense approach is to go for the maximum you want above ground, then go for the basement.
Just a couple more things. Maybe you could talk on cost and how this might relate to what's above ground.
Yeah, it's very difficult to relate them directly, but there is no question that building underground is more expensive. You're clearly involved in more excavations. There are certain measures one has to take to ensure the safety of the guys working underground. That's not only those who are excavating the thing, but also those constructing the basement. The materials are expensive in concrete, but overall, if one takes everything into account, there isn't much, if at all, a greater cost per square metre. And there certainly isn't for providing the basic structure. The other important thing to remember is the basement not only provides the additional habitable space that a client might be looking for, but of course it acts as the foundation for the house anyway. So the cost of the foundations for the conventional house really have to be deducted, as it were, from the overall cost of the basement. And bearing in mind the robustness, the period of time the structure will outlive anybody in those terms, it is actually not so much about cost, but really value for money. That's the issue. If one actually takes a proper costing, a proper comparison between, we'll say, a conventional foundation for a two-storey house and a basement underneath it, mindful that one gains all this additional habitable space and a foundation, value for money, they are excellent.
Finally, Passive House Standard. We like energy efficient homes on the podcast. Does this complicate basements at all, or in particular Glatar? How many of these projects come your way?
Passive basements are becoming, a passive house, of course, is becoming more popular. Perhaps not popular enough and hardly encouraged by a government, which has recently reduced previous standards for heat loss that it applied, which should have come into force in 2016, which presumably major business interest persuaded them not to. But passive housing is becoming more for people who are self-building, who are looking long-term for future-proofing. It involves, from the point of view of basement construction, nothing more in the terms of technically from the structure itself, but it's the level of insulation. For instance, to make a passive basement or the whole basement structure, bring that to passive level, one's talking typically of putting something between 250 and 300 millimetre of insulation underneath the basement, so the whole house will sit on it, and 200, maybe 250 millimetres of insulation to the walls. Insulation, for some reason, is expensive. It has to be XPX quality. It has to be extruded. It is the best form of insulation one can obtain. And, of course, that which is taking the loading of the building has to be able to take a certain compressive load, i.e. the total weight of the structure. So, achievable. How many do we do? Not that many. There isn't much demand for it. Unfortunately, it's the cost of the insulation which seems to be drive clients potentially to take a kind of halfway house, to insulate it maybe under the slab and to the walls, but not to the extent of achieving passive standard.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much for all your information today. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Head online to take a look at the show notes that accompany this session, houseplanninghelp.com/163, where you can review the key points. Got a few photos on there, and if you have a comment or you'd like to ask a question, just scroll down to the bottom of the show notes, houseplanninghelp.com/163. If you've got value out of today's podcast or one of our other podcasts, then can I ask for a favour here? If you haven't done so already, please write us an iTunes review. The reason for this is iTunes is the biggest podcast directory, and that means lots of potential eyeballs on there just reading down the list of what they could be listening to. So if you've written a review, hopefully it will give people a sense of what this podcast is about, whether it's for them or not. So, for example, it doesn't have to be long, just a couple of sentences. This is our first one of 2017 from John, who's in the UK. Great episode from Kat. That's the Centre for Alternative Technology. Pat Borer spoke so well in episode 158 that I found it practical and very inspirational. I think this one is one of my favourites of all. Keep it up, Ben. Thanks, John. Appreciate that. What you have to also visualise, I could have painted this picture at the time. When I went to see Pat, it's in Wales, and let's say it's a cold day outside because it would be in winter. And his house was warm, it had the fire on, crackling in the background. Pat had just cooked me a mushroom omelette. Didn't ask for this. As I arrived, he said, "Oh, I'm just cooking myself an omelette. Would you like one too?" So I'd have my omelette, I'd have my drink, my cup of tea. We were ready to go. And perhaps that was why they're just a lovely setting for recording. It's so cosy. So that's it for today. Really appreciate you being there yet again. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.